paralyzed millionaire falls in love with his caregiver, but an old flame appears and everything changes. Subscribe for more exciting stories. The Thompson Mansion, an imposing structure in the heart of Beverly Hills, had never seemed so silent. The footsteps of the staff, once so frequent along the Italian marble corridors, now echoed distant and cautious. In the second-floor office, Richard Thompson observed the city through the panoramic window, his wheelchair strategically positioned to contemplate the horizon of skyscrapers he had helped build. At 45, Richard was the embodiment of American business success. His real estate empire, built over 2 decades of relentless work, had transformed the urban landscape of several major cities. Now, ironically, he found himself imprisoned in his own luxury fortress, the consequence of a helicopter accident that had left him temporarily paralyzed from the waist down. Doctors spoke of the possibility of recovery, but time was a crucial factor. For Richard, however, every minute dragged on like an eternity. The man who used to lead decisive meetings and close multi-million-dollar deals now depended on help even for the most basic tasks, a reality that tore at his pride with each dawn. Margaret, his housekeeper for more than 15 years, organized the house routine with redoubled dedication, but her concern for her employer was visible. She watched helpless as Richard dismissed one after another all the nurses and physiotherapists who tried to help him. No professional could handle his explosive temper, aggravated by the frustration of his new condition. "Mr. Thompson," Margaret ventured that morning, after serving the coffee he had barely touched, "the agency has recommended a new caregiver. She has excellent references." "I don't need anyone else telling me what to do, Margaret." He cut her off without averting his gaze from the window. "I've already said I can manage on my own." The housekeeper sighed but stood her ground. "You can't go on like this, sir. Your company needs you. Your project—" "My company?" Richard laughed bitterly. "I have the best executives in the market. They can very well run everything without me for now." What he didn't admit was that, for the first time in his life, he felt afraid. Afraid of facing people, of showing his vulnerability, of being seen as less than the powerful man he had always been. Video calls with his team became increasingly rare, and visits from friends and business partners were systematically refused. Emily, his ex-fiancée, was one of the few people who still insisted on maintaining contact, even after the engagement was broken off a few weeks before the accident. Her daily messages remained unanswered on his phone, along with dozens of other notifications he refused to check. The loneliness, which before seemed like a conscious choice, began to weigh like a suffocating shadow over his days. The walls of the mansion, decorated with expensive works of art and exclusive designer furniture, seemed to close in on him each day. The garden, his former refuge for moments of reflection, remained untouched for weeks, visible only through the large windows that now served as frames for a life he could no longer reach. It was on a particularly difficult afternoon that Margaret decided to take a more assertive approach. After another frustrated attempt to convince him to accept help, she left an envelope on his desk containing the resume and references of Sarah Johnson, the new caregiver recommended by the agency. Unlike the other professionals, Sarah had a peculiar history and an approach that Margaret intuited could make a difference. "Just read it, please," she asked before leaving. "What do you have to lose?" Richard picked up the envelope with disinterest, but something in Margaret's tone made him hesitate before discarding it. As the sun set over Los Angeles, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, he finally opened the document. The attached photo showed a young woman with a serene appearance, with eyes that conveyed a silent determination. Her professional background was impressive, but it was one detail in particular that captured his attention. She too had gone through a transformative experience in her life, something that had made her choose this profession. That night, for the first time in weeks, Richard allowed himself to consider the possibility of change. Not because he believed this caregiver would be different from the others, but because, deep in his soul, he began to realize that he couldn't continue living in the shadows of his own mansion forever. The silence of the night was interrupted only by the soft sound of his wheels on the marble floor as he made his way to his bedroom, leaving behind the open envelope on the table, a small but significant opening to what was to come. The dawn brought with it a subtle change in the air of the Thompson mansion. Margaret, with her intuition sharpened by years of service, immediately noticed the difference upon entering Richard's office. The envelope she had left the night before was open, its contents carefully organized on the mahogany desk. Richard was already there, his wheelchair positioned facing the window as usual. But there was something different in his posture, an almost imperceptible tension that suggested expectation. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," Margaret greeted, cautious. "Would you like breakfast here or in the dining room today?" There was a pause before he answered, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Here is fine, Margaret, and you can call the agency. Tell them we accept their recommendation." The housekeeper could barely contain a smile of relief. "Yes, sir, I'll do that immediately." As Margaret withdrew to arrange for coffee and make the call, Richard turned his attention back to the city awakening outside. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to consider the future, however uncertain it might be. Sarah Johnson arrived punctually at 9 a.m. the next day. Dressed simply but impeccably, she brought with her only a small suitcase and an air of quiet confidence. Margaret received her at the entrance, impressed by the serene aura the young woman emanated. "Welcome, Ms. Johnson," Margaret smiled, guiding her through the mansion's foyer. "Mr. Thompson is waiting for you in the office. I should warn you, he can be challenging." Sarah nodded, her gaze revealing an understanding that went beyond her words. "Thank you for the warning, Margaret. I'm prepared for the challenges that will come." As they entered the office, they found Richard with his back to the door, his wheelchair turned towards the window. The silence was palpable, laden with unspoken expectations. "Mr. Thompson," Margaret announced, "Miss Johnson is here." Richard slowly turned his chair, his dark eyes examining Sarah with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "So, you're the new caregiver," he stated, his voice a mix of challenge and resignation. Sarah took a step forward, maintaining eye contact. "Yes, Mr. Thompson. I'm here to help you in whatever way necessary." "And what makes you think you can help where others have failed?" Richard questioned, a touch of irony in his voice. Sarah's response surprised everyone with its frankness. "I don't presume anything, Mr. Thompson. I'm here for us to work together on your recovery. Success will depend on both of us." A flash of interest crossed Richard's face. Here was someone who wasn't easily intimidated, someone who saw him not as an invalid to be cared for, but as a partner in his own recovery. "Very well, Miss Johnson," he said after a moment. "Let's see what you're capable of." The days that followed were a test of wills. Sarah established a rigorous routine of exercises and therapies, always adapting her approaches to Richard's needs and mood. She didn't let herself be discouraged by his occasional outbursts of anger or frustration, always responding with an unshakable calm that, little by little, began to positively influence the atmosphere of the mansion. One morning, during a particularly challenging physiotherapy session, Richard exploded. "This is useless. Can't you see it's not helping at all?" Sarah, instead of backing down, approached him, her firm gaze meeting his. "Mr. Thompson, you built an empire. Do you really believe that happened overnight? Every small progress counts. Your recovery will be no different." Her words hit Richard like a bolt of clarity. For the first time since the accident, he found himself confronted not with pity or condescension, but with a truth he couldn't ignore. The silence that followed was broken by the distant sound of Margaret's phone. Moments later, the housekeeper hurriedly entered the room, her face a mask of concern. "Mr. Thompson, it's Miss Emily. She insists on speaking with you. Says it's urgent." The name of his ex-fiancée hung in the air like a storm cloud. Richard hesitated, his eyes meeting Sarah's for a brief instant before turning to Margaret. "Tell her I'm busy. I'll call back later." Margaret nodded and left, leaving Richard and Sarah alone again. The silence that followed was charged with unresolved tension. "I think that's enough for today," Richard finally said, his voice softer. "Thank you, Ms. Johnson." Sarah merely nodded, respecting her patient's moment of introspection. As she tidied up the physiotherapy equipment, Richard observed her, a new understanding forming in his mind. That night, alone in his room, Richard reflected on the subtle changes that were beginning to occur. Sarah's presence had brought not just a new routine, but a different perspective on his situation. For the first time since the accident, he found himself considering not just his current state, but the possibilities the future might bring. Outside, the mansion's garden, long neglected, seemed to cry out for attention under the moonlight. Richard, looking out the window, made a mental note to ask Margaret to call the gardeners. It was time to bring life back to all corners of his existence. As sleep finally reached him, Richard couldn't imagine the twists and turns that awaited him. Sarah's arrival was just the beginning of a journey that would test not only his physical strength, but also the limits of his heart and soul. The weeks passed, and the routine at the Thompson mansion acquired a new rhythm. The garden, once neglected, now flourished under the meticulous care of the gardeners, reflecting the gradual transformation occurring inside the house. Richard, although still reluctant in many aspects, began to show signs of progress. His sessions with Sarah became more productive, and slowly he rediscovered strength in long-forgotten muscles. But it wasn't just his body that was changing. His mind, once focused exclusively on business and power, began to open up to new perspectives. One afternoon, while resting after a particularly intense session, Richard surprised Sarah with an unexpected question. "What made you choose this profession, Miss Johnson?" Sarah, always professional, hesitated for a moment before answering. "It's a long story, Mr. Thompson. Are you sure you want to hear it?" Richard nodded, his curiosity genuine for the first time in a long time. "Well," she began, "a few years ago I was a marketing executive living a very different life. But then my younger sister suffered a serious accident. She was paralyzed, just like you." Richard's eyes widened slightly, an unexpected connection forming. "I gave up everything to care for her," Sarah continued. "At first it was out of obligation, but over time I realized I had found a greater purpose. Seeing my sister recover not just her movements but also her will to live transformed me. I decided I wanted to do this for other people." The silence that followed was charged with emotion. Richard, for the first time, saw Sarah not just as his caregiver, but as someone who deeply understood what he was going through. "And your sister?" he asked softly. A smile illuminated Sarah's face. "She's doing great now, married with 2 kids. Sometimes when I see her running after the children, I can hardly believe how far she's come." That conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. Richard began to open up more, sharing not just his frustrations with recovery, but also details of his life before the accident. One day, while practicing mobility exercises in the newly renovated garden, Richard confided, "You know, Sarah, I used to think that success was measured only by the numbers in a bank account or the size of the empire you build. Now, being able to stand up from this chair for a few seconds seems like the greatest achievement in the world." Sarah smiled, understanding. "Sometimes, Mr. Thompson, it's the small victories that teach us the greatest lessons." As his connection with Sarah deepened, Richard found himself gradually reopening other aspects of his life. He restarted video calls with his team, surprising himself with the relief and genuine joy he saw on the faces of his employees. The pre-accident Richard might have interpreted this reaction as weakness, but now he saw it for what it really was: sincere concern. However, not all changes were easy to accept. Emily's persistence in trying to contact him intensified. Her messages, previously ignored, now bothered him with an uncomfortable frequency. One night, after a particularly exhausting session, Richard finally gave in and answered one of her calls. "Richard, darling," Emily's voice sounded shrill through the phone. "Finally, I've been so worried. Why haven't you returned my calls?" "Hello, Emily," he replied, his tone cautious. "I've been busy with my recovery." "Oh, of course," she responded quickly. "That's why I'm calling. I heard you hired a new caregiver. Are you sure that's a good idea? You barely know her." The distrust in Emily's voice bothered him. "Sarah is more than competent, Emily. She's been doing an excellent job." "I see," Emily replied, her voice taking on a tone that Richard knew well. The tone she used when she was planning something. "Well, maybe I should pay a visit soon, to see how you're progressing." The idea of Emily entering his new world, so carefully constructed over the past few weeks, caused a wave of anxiety in Richard. "I don't think that's a good idea right now, Emily. I'm still adapting to many changes." "But Richard," she insisted, "you need someone who really knows you around. Someone who understands your needs, your business." "Emily," he interrupted her firmly, "I appreciate your concern, but I'm fine. When I'm ready for visits, I'll get in touch." The silence that followed was tense. Finally, Emily spoke. her voice now cold. "Very well, Richard. But remember, there's a lot at stake here. Not just for you, but for all of us." After hanging up, Richard was thoughtful. Emily's words echoed in his mind, bringing to the surface concerns he had pushed to the back of his thoughts. His business, his empire. How much longer could he stay away before everything started to crumble? That night, as he observed the moonlit garden, Richard felt the weight of his past and the uncertainty of his future weighing on his shoulders. He had made progress, yes, but the world out there, the world he had once dominated, would not wait forever. The soft sound of wheels on the floor interrupted his thoughts. Sarah entered silently, bringing his nightly medication. "Is everything all right, Mr. Thompson?" she asked, noticing his worried expression. Richard hesitated for a moment before answering. "Sarah, do you think it's possible to rebuild an entire life?" She observed him for a long moment before responding. "I believe it's possible to build a better life, Mr. Thompson, but that requires courage to let go of what no longer serves and embrace new possibilities." Her words hung in the air, laden with meaning. Richard nodded slowly, feeling that he was on the verge of a decision that would change everything. What he didn't know was that the events that would follow would test this new resolution in ways he could never have imagined. The dawn brought a different energy to the Thompson mansion. Richard, inspired by the previous night's conversation with Sarah, decided to take a bold step towards his old life. For the first time since the accident, he called for an in-person meeting with his executive team. The news spread quickly through the company, causing a mixture of expectation and apprehension. Margaret, sensing the change in the air, dedicated herself to preparing the house for the event, while Sarah helped Richard prepare physically and mentally. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Sarah asked as she helped Richard put on one of his old suits, now slightly loose. Richard nodded, a determined glint in his eyes. "I need to do this, Sarah. I can't hide forever." The morning of the meeting arrived, bringing with it a palpable tension. The executives arrived in their luxury cars, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and concern. Among them, to Richard's surprise, was Emily. "Richard, darling," she exclaimed, approaching to kiss him on the cheek. "I couldn't miss such an important moment." Richard, caught off guard, merely nodded, aware of Sarah's attentive gaze, who remained discreetly in the background. The meeting began, and Richard felt a wave of familiarity as he led the discussion. He listened to reports, asked incisive questions, and made decisions with the same sharpness as before. For a moment, it was as if the accident had never happened. However, as the meeting progressed, Richard began to notice subtle exchanges of glances between some executives and Emily. There was a dynamic there that he couldn't fully decipher. When the meeting ended and the executives began to leave, Emily remained, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Richard, we need to talk," she said, her voice low and urgent. "In private." Reluctant but intrigued, Richard agreed. He asked Sarah to leave them alone, noting the hesitation in her eyes before she left. As soon as they were alone, Emily dropped her mask of cordiality. "Richard, you have no idea what's going on, do you?" "What are you talking about, Emily?" Richard asked, his brow furrowing. She sighed, a mixture of frustration and what seemed to be genuine concern in her voice. "While you're here playing recovery with your caregiver, the board is moving against you. They think you're no longer fit to lead." The words hit Richard like a punch. "That's absurd. I founded this company, built it from the ground up." "I know, darling," Emily replied, her voice softening. "That's why I'm here, to protect you, your legacy. But we need to act fast." Richard felt his head spin. All the progress he thought he had made suddenly seemed insignificant in the face of this new threat. "What do you suggest?" Emily's eyes gleamed with an intensity that Richard knew well from the times they had worked together on difficult negotiations. "First, you need to show strength, control. No more visible caregivers or therapies. Second, we need to meet with the major shareholders, reaffirm your position." As Emily outlined her plan, Richard found himself divided. Part of him wanted to grasp at this chance to regain control of his professional life, to prove that he was still the same man as before. Another part, however, a part that had grown in the past few weeks under Sarah's care, hesitated. "Think about it, Richard," Emily concluded, rising to leave. "We don't have much time." After Emily's departure, Richard remained silent, immersed in conflicting thoughts. It was Sarah's gentle touch on his shoulder that brought him back to reality. "Is everything all right, Mr. Thompson?" she asked, her voice full of genuine concern. Richard hesitated, internally debating whether he should share what he had just discovered. Finally, he decided on honesty. "Sarah, it seems I have more challenges ahead than I imagined." As he recounted the conversation with Emily, Sarah listened attentively, her face a mask of professional calm. When he finished, she remained silent for a moment before speaking. "Mr. Thompson, you built an empire based on your vision and strength, but perhaps now is the time to lead in a different way. One that shows not just your strength, but also your capacity for adaptation and growth." Sarah's words resonated deeply with Richard. He found himself at a crossroads, having to choose between going back to being the man he was before, guided by relentless ambition and fear of showing weakness, or embracing this new version of himself, more vulnerable, but perhaps more authentic. That night, as the mansion quieted down, Richard remained awake, pondering the future. The garden, visible from his window, seemed to reflect his state of mind, parts still recovering, others flourishing with new life. The decision he would make in the coming days would affect not only his career, but the entire course of his life from then on. What Richard didn't know was that forces beyond his control were already in motion, and that his journey of self-discovery was about to face its greatest test yet. The days following the meeting were a whirlwind of emotions and decisions for Richard. The mansion, once a silent refuge, now buzzed with nervous energy. Constant phone calls, unexpected visits from executives, and Emily's increasingly frequent presence created a palpable atmosphere of tension. Richard found himself divided between two worlds: the corporate universe he had built and dominated for years, and the new path of self-discovery and healing he had begun with Sarah. The pressure to make a decision grew with each day. One morning, while doing his exercises in the garden under Sarah's watchful supervision, Richard finally verbalized his internal conflicts. "Sarah," he began, his voice laden with contained emotion, "my whole life was built around success, power. The idea of losing all that, it's terrifying." Sarah observed him with understanding, carefully choosing her words. "Mr. Thompson, what do you consider to be everything? Is the true Richard Thompson really just about titles and bank accounts?" The question hung in the air, challenging. Richard was silent for a long moment, reflecting. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost vulnerable. "You know, Sarah, before the accident, I barely stopped to appreciate this garden. Now each flower, each leaf seems to have a special meaning. It's as if I'm seeing the world for the first time." Sarah smiled gently. "Perhaps that's the true wealth you've discovered on this journey." At that moment, they were interrupted by Emily's abrupt arrival. Her gaze swept over the scene, Richard in his wheelchair, Sarah by his side, with a mixture of disapproval and concern. "Richard, darling," she said, her voice sweet but with an edge of urgency, "we need to talk. It's about tomorrow's board meeting." Richard felt a wave of tension course through his body. The board meeting, the moment that could define the future of his company, and consequently his life as he knew it. "Of course, Emily," he replied, casting an apologetic look at Sarah. "We can talk in the office." As Emily guided him inside, Richard couldn't help but notice Sarah's concerned look. There was something in her eyes, a mixture of worry and something else, something he couldn't quite decipher. In the office, Emily wasted no time with preliminaries. "Richard, tomorrow is crucial. The board is divided. Some still believe in you, but others, well, they think it's time for a change in leadership." Richard felt the weight of years of hard work and dedication bearing down on his shoulders. "What do you suggest, Emily?" Her eyes gleamed with determination. "We need to show strength. You'll attend in person, of course. No wheelchair. We'll use canes if necessary. And I'll be by your side, as I've always been." Emily's words evoked memories of countless corporate battles they had faced together in the past. For a moment, Richard found himself tempted to plunge back into that familiar world of strategies and power. "What about my recovery?" he asked, a part of him already knowing the answer. Emily made a dismissive gesture with her hand. "That can wait. The important thing now is to secure your position. After that, you'll have all the time in the world to recover." Richard nodded slowly, feeling divided. Part of him yearned for the adrenaline of corporate battle, for the chance to prove he was still the strong, decisive leader he once was. Another part, however, a part that had grown and strengthened in recent weeks, hesitated. When Emily finally left, leaving him with plans and strategies for the next day's meeting, Richard found himself immersed in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He wheeled his chair to the window, his eyes scanning the garden that had become his refuge. It was then that he noticed Sarah still out there tidying up the physiotherapy equipment. There was a grace in her movements, a silent dedication that touched him deeply. At that moment, Richard realized that his decision was not just about business or power. It was about the kind of person he wanted to be from now on. As the sun set, casting long shadows over the garden, Richard found himself at a crossroads. On one side, the familiar path of power and ambition, represented by Emily and the corporate world he had always known. On the other, an uncertain but potentially more rewarding path of self-discovery and personal growth, symbolized by Sarah and the journey of recovery they had begun together. Night fell over the Thompson mansion, enveloping it in a cloak of quietude. But within the walls of the house, and even more so within Richard's heart, a storm of emotions and decisions was brewing. The following morning would bring not just a board meeting, but a defining moment in the life of a man in search of his true self. What Richard didn't know was that fate had its own plans, and that the decisions he would make in the coming hours would have consequences that would go far beyond his professional life, touching the depths of his heart in ways he could never have imagined. Richard forced a smile. "I am Margaret. Just thoughtful." At that moment, Sarah entered the room, bringing with her an aura of calm that contrasted with the agitation around her. Her eyes met Richard's, conveying a silent message of support. "Mr. Thompson," she said softly, "would you like to do some relaxation exercises before the meeting?" Before Richard could respond, Emily's voice echoed down the hallway. "Richard, darling, we're running late." Emily entered the room like a hurricane, impeccably dressed and with a fierce determination in her eyes. She cast a quick, cold glance at Sarah before turning to Richard. "Come on. There's no time for exercises now. The car is waiting." Richard felt torn, his gaze oscillating between Sarah and Emily. Finally, with a resigned sigh, he nodded to Emily. "I'm ready." As he was being led out, Richard couldn't help but notice the look of concern on Sarah's face. There was something in her eyes, a mixture of apprehension and, was it affection? The journey to the office was tense, with Emily going over strategies and Richard absorbing everything in silence. Upon arrival, they were greeted by an anxious reception of executives and board members. The meeting began, and Richard felt the familiar adrenaline of the corporate arena rushing through his veins. He presented reports, answered tough questions, and defended his vision for the company's future with an eloquence that surprised even himself. However, as the meeting progressed, Richard began to notice nuances that would have escaped him before. The way some board members avoided his gaze, the quick exchanges of looks between Emily and certain executives, the underlying tension that permeated the environment. It was during a break that Richard, discreetly secluded in a corner of the room, overheard a conversation that would change everything. "Is Emily sure she can convince him to sign?" one of the board members whispered. "She guarantees it," another replied in a low voice. "With Richard out of the way, we can restructure the company as planned." The shock of the revelation hit Richard like lightning. Suddenly, everything became clear. The subtle manipulations, Emily's insistence, the rush to have him resume control only to, force him to give up everything. With his heart racing, Richard did the only thing he could at that moment. He called for a recess. Claiming the need for a medical break, he withdrew to a private room, his mind in turmoil. It was in this moment of crisis that Richard did something unexpected. He called Sarah. "Sarah," he said as soon as she answered, his voice trembling, "I need your help." On the other end of the line, Sarah's calm and firm voice was like a balm. "I'm on my way, Mr. Thompson. Take a deep breath and trust yourself." As he waited, Richard found himself confronting not just Emily and the board's betrayal, but also his own choices and priorities. The person he was before the accident would have reacted with fury and vengeance. But now, after weeks of introspection and growth alongside Sarah, he wondered, who did he really want to be? Sarah arrived discreetly, her presence bringing a wave of relief to Richard. In a few minutes, she helped him recenter himself, using breathing techniques and offering words of encouragement. "Mr. Thompson," she said, gently holding his hands, "remember who you are. Not the businessman, not the corporate leader, but the man I've seen emerge over these past weeks. Trust that person." Sarah's words resonated deeply with Richard. At that moment, looking into her eyes, he felt a clarity that had eluded him for so long. When Richard returned to the boardroom, there was a new aura about him. Emily, noticing the change, shot him a questioning look, but he merely nodded slightly, indicating he was ready to continue. What followed was one of the most impactful presentations of Richard Thompson's career, but not for the reasons everyone expected. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," he began, his voice firm and clear, "I came here today not just to defend my position as leader of this company, but to propose a new vision for our future." The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on him. "In recent weeks, I've faced the greatest challenge of my life, and in that process, I've learned more about myself and about the true meaning of leadership than in all the previous years combined." Richard then outlined a new strategy for the company, one that prioritized not just profit, but also employee well-being, social responsibility, and sustainable innovation. He spoke about the importance of adaptability, empathy, and long-term vision. As he spoke, Richard could see the change in expressions around him. Some board members looked intrigued, others clearly impressed. Emily, on the other hand, could barely hide her discomfort. In concluding, Richard made an announcement that caught everyone by surprise. "And to implement this new vision, I will be forming a new leadership team. A team that reflects the values I've just presented." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard knew he had just set in motion a series of events that would change not only the future of the company, but also the course of his own life. As the meeting concluded in a whirlwind of discussions and negotiations, Richard found himself looking out the window in the direction of his mansion. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace and purpose. What the future held was still uncertain, but of one thing Richard was sure. The man who left that boardroom was very different from the one who had entered, and a large part of that transformation, he knew, was due to the constant and inspiring presence of a certain caregiver who had become much more than that in his life. The days following the board meeting were a whirlwind of changes in Richard Thompson's life. The mansion, once a silent refuge, now pulsed with new energy. The garden, in particular, seemed to reflect its owner's internal transformation, with new flowers blooming each day. Richard, driven by his newly discovered clarity of purpose, dove headfirst into restructuring his company. Long hours were dedicated to video conferences, project analyses, and interviews with potential new members for his leadership team. However, unlike in the past, he now balanced this intense work with moments of reflection and self-care. Sarah remained a constant and comforting presence, helping not only with Richard's physical recovery, but also offering an attentive ear and thoughtful advice when requested. On a particularly busy afternoon, while reviewing some physiotherapy exercises in the garden, Richard shared his thoughts with Sarah. "You know, Sarah," he began, his gaze lost in the newly planted flowers, "I never imagined that a change in perspective could be so liberating." Sarah smiled, gently adjusting Richard's posture. "Sometimes, Mr. Thompson, our greatest limitations are those we impose on ourselves." Richard nodded, thoughtful. "You're right. And speaking of limitation," he hesitated for a moment before continuing, "I think it's time we drop the formalities. Please, call me Richard." The look of surprise and the slight blush on Sarah's cheeks didn't go unnoticed by Richard. There was a connection growing between them, subtle but undeniable. However, not everything was rosy. Richard's decision to restructure the company and move away from old practices sent shockwaves through the corporate world. Emily, in particular, did not take the changes well. One morning, she appeared at the mansion without warning, her face a mask of barely contained indignation. "Richard!" she exclaimed upon seeing him in the office, Sarah discreetly withdrawing to give them privacy. "What do you think you're doing? You're throwing away years of hard work." Richard remained calm, his voice firm but gentle. "Emily, I'm not throwing anything away. I'm building something better, something more meaningful." "More meaningful?" she scoffed. "Since when do you care about that?" The Richard I know cared about results, about power. Maybe that Richard doesn't exist anymore, he replied softly. People change, Emily. I've changed. The discussion that followed was heated, with Emily alternating between emotional pleas and veiled threats. But Richard remained unwavering in his decision. When Emily finally left, slamming the door behind her, Richard felt a mixture of relief and sadness. It was the definitive end of an important chapter in his life. Sarah, who had waited patiently outside, entered the office silently. Without saying a word, she approached Richard and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Richard covered her hand with his, grateful for the silent support. "I am. In fact, I think I'm better than ever." At that moment, looking into Sarah's eyes, Richard felt something shift inside him. The gratitude and respect he felt for her were evolving into something deeper, something he wasn't yet fully ready to name. The following weeks brought a series of challenges and victories. The new direction of Richard's company began to gain positive attention from the media and investors interested in more ethical and sustainable business practices. His physical recovery was also advancing by leaps and bounds, with Richard now able to take a few steps with the help of crutches. One evening after a particularly productive day, Richard invited Sarah to dinner on the mansion's terrace. The setting was almost magical. The softly lit garden, the city of Los Angeles shimmering in the distance, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of flowers. As they savored the meal prepared by Margaret, the conversation flowed naturally, touching on topics from changes in the company to personal dreams and aspirations. In a moment of pause, Richard gathered courage to address a subject that had been occupying his thoughts. "Sarah," he began, his heart racing, "these past weeks have been transformative for me, largely thanks to you." Sarah smiled, her eyes shining in the candlelight. "You did all the hard work, Richard. I was just here to support you." "No," Richard gently insisted. "It was much more than that. You helped me rediscover who I am, to see the world and myself in a completely new way." There was a moment of silence laden with emotion. Richard could feel his heart pounding, aware that he was on the brink of something important. "Sarah, He hesitated, searching for the right words. "I think I'm..." At that instant, Richard's phone rang, breaking the moment. It was an important call related to the company, something that couldn't be ignored. As he answered the call, casting an apologetic look at Sarah, Richard felt a mixture of frustration and anticipation. The moment had passed, but something had irrevocably changed between them. The evening ended with a silent promise that the conversation would be resumed. As Sarah said goodbye, her gentle touch on Richard's arm carried a new intimacy, a promise of future possibilities. Richard stayed on the terrace for a long time after she left, observing the city lights and reflecting on the path that had brought him here. He knew there were still challenges ahead, in the company, in his recovery, and in his heart. But for the first time in a long time, he felt truly hopeful about the future. What Richard didn't know was that fate still had some surprises in store for him, and that his journey of self-discovery and love was far from over. The weeks following the dinner on the terrace brought a new dynamic to the Thompson mansion. The air seemed charged with unspoken possibilities, with Richard and Sarah dancing around feelings that grew each day, but which neither dared to name openly. Richard immersed himself in his work with renewed vigor, implementing significant changes in his company. The new approach, focused on sustainability and social responsibility, was beginning to bear fruit. Ethical investors were showing interest, and the company's public image was improving considerably. In parallel, his physical recovery was advancing remarkably. With Sarah's constant help, Richard could now walk for longer periods, using only a cane for support. Each step was a victory, silently celebrated between the two. It was during one of these physiotherapy sessions in the garden that the delicate balance between them was challenged. Richard, concentrating on maintaining the correct posture, stumbled slightly. Sarah, always attentive, promptly supported him. For a moment they were close, very close, their faces inches apart. Time seemed to freeze. Richard's eyes met Sarah's, and in that instant, all the unspoken emotions seemed ready to overflow. But before either could act, the shrill sound of Richard's phone broke the moment. It was Margaret, her voice urgent on the other end of the line. "Mr. Richard, Ms. Emily is here. She insists on seeing you immediately. She seems agitated." Richard felt a tightness in his chest. Emily had kept her distance since their last heated discussion. What could bring her back and in this state? "I'll be there in a minute, Margaret," he replied, hanging up the phone and turning to Sarah with an apologetic look. Sarah nodded understandingly, helping him compose himself. "Go. I'll be here if you need me." As he entered his office, Richard found Emily pacing back and forth, her face a mask of anguish and anger. Seeing him, she stopped abruptly. "Richard," her voice trembled, "you can't do this. You can't throw everything away like this." Confused, Richard tried to calm her. "Emily, what are you talking about?" She threw a newspaper on the desk. The headline screamed, "Thompson Empire reinvents itself. CEO announces radical changes and new board." "This," Emily exclaimed. "You're destroying everything we built together. And for what? Because of this? This caregiver?" The mention of Sarah made Richard straighten up, his voice gaining a steely tone. "This has nothing to do with Sarah, Emily. These are decisions I've made thinking about the company's future and what's right." Emily laughed bitterly. "Oh, please, I know you, Richard. Or at least I did. Since when do you care about what's right? We built this empire together, doing what was necessary." Emily's words hit Richard like a punch. Memories of questionable decisions, of dark corners of his rise to power that he preferred to forget, came to the surface. "People change, Emily," he replied softly. "I've changed." "Changed?" she scoffed. "Or are you being manipulated? This caregiver, she doesn't know the world we live in, Richard. She doesn't understand what's at stake." For a moment, a seed of doubt planted itself in Richard's heart. What if Emily was right? What if he was being naive, throwing away everything he had achieved? It was in this moment of vulnerability that Emily made her final move. Approaching, she gently touched Richard's face. "It's not too late, darling. We can fix this together, like we always have." The familiar touch, the promise of returning to the known, was tempting. For a brief moment, Richard found himself on the edge of a precipice, looking back at the comfort of his old self. But then, like a beacon in the darkness, Sarah's image emerged in his mind. Not just Sarah, but everything she represented. Growth, authenticity, the possibility of being a better version of himself. With gentleness but firmness, Richard removed Emily's hand. "No, Emily, we can't go back, and honestly, I don't want to." Emily's face contorted in a mixture of pain and fury. "You'll regret this, Richard. When everything crumbles, don't say I didn't warn you." With those words, she stormed out, leaving Richard alone with his turbulent thoughts. Minutes passed before a soft knock on the door brought him back to reality. It was Sarah, her face a mask of concern. "Is everything okay?" she asked softly. Richard looked at her, really looked, and at that moment, all doubts dissipated. "It is now," he replied, a genuine smile forming on his lips. Sarah entered the room, closing the door behind her. There was something in the air, an electricity, a sense that they were on the verge of something monumental. "Richard," Sarah began, her voice trembling slightly, "I think we need to talk." Richard nodded, his heart racing. He knew that whatever was said in the next few moments would change everything, forever. The sun was setting outside, casting golden shadows across the office, as two souls prepared to take a leap of faith towards an unknown but promising future. Richard's office was bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere. The silence between Richard and Sarah was palpable, laden with unspoken emotions and infinite possibilities. Sarah was the first to break the silence, her voice soft but firm. "Richard, these past few months have been extraordinary. Seeing you transform, rediscover yourself, has been an incredible journey to witness and be a part of." Richard felt his heart race. He knew they were on the brink of something crucial, something that could change their lives forever. "Sarah," he began, his voice hoarse with emotion, "you didn't just witness this journey, you made it possible. You showed me a side of life I didn't even know existed." He paused, gathering courage to continue. "But now I find myself in a dilemma. As your employer, I know I shouldn't—" Sarah gently interrupted him, taking a step towards him. "Richard, I think we both know that our relationship has long since surpassed the boundaries of employer and employee. The air between them seemed electrified. Richard stood up from his chair, leaning on his cane but feeling stronger than ever. "Sarah, I think I'm in love with you," he finally confessed, the words coming out like a torrent. "And it scares me. Not just because of the age difference or our situation, but because I've never felt anything like this before. It's as if you've awakened a part of me that I didn't even know existed." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, a smile illuminating her face. "Oh, Richard," she whispered, "I'm in love with you too. And it's been the hardest thing in the world trying to hide it." At that moment, all barriers between them seemed to crumble. Richard took a step forward, dropping his cane, and Sarah met him halfway. Their lips met in a tender and passionate kiss, years of repressed emotions finally finding expression. When they separated, both were laughing and crying at the same time. The joy of their newly declared love mixed with the relief of finally being able to be honest with each other. However, reality soon made itself present. "What will we do now?" Sarah asked, her voice a mixture of hope and concern. Richard smiled, a glint of determination in his eyes. "We'll do what's right, for us and for everyone around us." In the days that followed, Richard and Sarah carefully navigated the waters of their new relationship. Richard called a meeting with his leadership team, where he announced not only his relationship with Sarah, but also his decision to gradually step away from the day-to-day management of the company. "It's time to pass the baton," he declared, to the surprise of many. "We've built something incredible here, and now I want to ensure that it continues, with new leaders who share our vision of an ethical and sustainable business." The news of their relationship and his decision to step back caused a stir in the media and the corporate world. There were criticisms, of course, and malicious insinuations, but to the surprise of many, there was also a wave of support. Richard's story, his recovery, his personal and professional transformation captured the public's imagination. Emily, as expected, was not happy with the developments. She made some attempts to undermine Richard and Sarah's credibility, but her actions ended up exposing her own questionable motivations. In the end, she opted to distance herself completely, selling her shares in the company and leaving Los Angeles. Meanwhile, at the Thompson mansion, life took on new contours. The garden, once a symbol of isolation, became a haven of peace and renewal for the couple. Richard, now walking with much more ease, spent hours tending to the plants alongside Sarah. Margaret, who had witnessed the entire transformation, couldn't be happier. "I've never seen you so radiant, Mr. Richard," she commented one day, tears in her eyes. As the months passed, Richard and Sarah began to plan for the future. They decided to use part of Richard's fortune to establish a foundation focused on rehabilitation and support for people with disabilities. Sarah, with her experience and compassion, would be instrumental in managing this new venture. On a sunny afternoon, almost a year after the fateful accident that had changed everything, Richard and Sarah were sitting in the garden, watching the sunset. Richard held Sarah's hand, their fingers intertwined, a small ring shining on her finger. "You know," Richard began, his voice full of emotion, "there was a time when I thought that accident had ruined my life. Now I see it was the beginning of it." Sarah smiled, squeezing his hand. "Life has a funny way of giving us exactly what we need, even when we think it's the last thing we want." Richard nodded, pulling her closer. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Sarah. You taught me that true strength isn't in power or money, but in the capacity to love and reinvent oneself." As the sun disappeared over the horizon, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange, Richard and Sarah remained embraced, living symbols of transformation, love, and hope. The Thompson mansion, once a monument to loneliness and power, now pulsed with new life, a testament to the power of love to heal and renew. And so, under the starry sky of Los Angeles, a new story began. A story of two hearts that found each other at the most unlikely moment, proving that true love knows no bounds of age, circumstance, or past. It was the beginning of a new chapter, full of promises, challenges, and above all, true love.